Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released remake of the original Mafia game, and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the original release of the game from 2002. For this analysis, both games are being played on the PC with their settings pushed up as high as possible at a native 4K resolution, though for the sake of capturing cleaner still images, the motion blur options will be disabled. Also, before we get started, it is important to remember that there's nearly 2 decades separating these two titles. So we're obviously going to notice visual improvements across the board for this latest remake. So the goal for this video is not necessarily to determine which looks better, but rather how the remake has adopted the original's characters, environments, and gameplay, and improved on them, and whether all the changes result in a better overall experience. Alright, so let's get right into it with an in-depth look at how the presentation has changed, starting with our character models. Now it should come as no surprise that the Definitive Edition's character models look substantially better than its 18-year-old predecessor. Each of the main character models in the remake are composed of roughly 40,000 polygons, as opposed to the much simpler 2,000 polygons used to make up the characters in the old game. And the texture maps applied to things like clothing, skin, hair, and other accessories look phenomenal. Now, Mafia 1's character models, while dated, don't necessarily look bad either, especially for a game released in 2002. The textures that were created for lead characters like Tommy and Salieri have aged pretty nicely, but once they start talking and moving, that's when the game really starts to show its age. Thanks to more sophisticated motion capture technology, the characters in the remake can express far more emotion in each of their respective scenes, providing additional nuance that was never noticeable before. The opening sequence with Tommy and the detective, for example, has an entirely different feel to it, which I'll expand upon more in a bit. But for now, let's move on to talk about the environments. The environments have received a gigantic overhaul for this remake. Everything has been completely built from scratch, with brand new streets and alleyways that aid in creating a far more convincing Lost Heaven cityscape. For those of you unfamiliar, the original Mafia game is a period piece that takes place during the 1930s. The city itself is fictional, though it does share many aspects of real American cities during that time period, mainly Chicago, Illinois. But when you look back at the city in the original game now, it's kind of hard to tell where and when you are. The rows of buildings offer very little variety, giving each street corner a nearly indistinguishable look. And the only hint that it takes place in the early 20th century are the low-poly car models driving by. But the remake takes all of this to an entirely new level, with higher res textures, increased pedestrian and vehicle density, and significantly more attention to detail. The streets are now loaded with all sorts of period-appropriate decor, from big old-timey billboards for things like Swift Cola, to cheap labor posters that were common during the Great Depression. I especially love this new Little Italy area that has a bunch of merchants selling on the street corner, kind of like that flashback sequence in The Godfather Part 2. In the original, you never had anything like this. The streets were mostly barren, with only the occasional cable car or jaywalker to help break up the monotony of it. Considering how pointless it is to walk around in either game, it's an understandable sacrifice the original developers made, but I greatly appreciate Hangar 13 doing their best here to really bring the city to life. When looking at interior spaces, we can see a similar huge uptick in quality, with fully rendered spaces and dynamic objects that can be destroyed during shootouts. There's even a few details that have been retained as a sort of homage to the original, like this horse painting hanging up in the conference room. But what really brings this new depiction of Lost Heaven to life is the redesign to the lighting. The lighting has seen a significant evolution throughout the course of the series' history, going from the plain, lifeless, and static appearance in the first game to more advanced techniques used now. These techniques include things like global illumination, some subtle bloom and god rays, along with effects like screen space reflections and specular lighting to help bring out the new puddles after a heavy downpour. I especially like the inclusion of new volumetric effects that have been used to completely transform the appearance of key scenes, including this one, where the truck's headlights now reflect off of the low-hanging fog. The shadows are similarly improved, with much more accurate character and object projections, along with entire streets cast in darkness depending on the position of the sun. There are a few instances where the lighting and shadows can be a bit much, sometimes washing out the scene with excessive bloom, but this only accounts for a small percentage of the experience, and it's hardly noticeable. Next up, we have effects. There's so much that can be said here when talking about the effects, from the improved fire simulation, water surfaces, and explosions, to the enhanced rain that, when coupled with the specular lighting effects, helped to drastically change the feel of some of the most epic moments. But I think one of the most important effects worth showcasing here are the physics. The original game released right before the time physics started to become really popular in gaming. So things like ragdoll bodies, dynamic props, and destruction are either really simplistic or just not incorporated at all. But with the remake, you get a lot more dynamic props to smash through, along with much more realistic death animations for enemies that combine the visceral bleed-out animations with some pretty decent ragdoll physics. You'll even notice some enhanced cloth simulation throughout the game, especially with the character's clothing, that seems to realistically fold and bend depending on the player's movement. When considering the entire visual design collectively, you end up with an experience that's leaps and bounds better than the original. But of course, this is to be expected. So now, let's switch gears and talk about the gameplay, starting with the general movement and controls. Both the original and the remake feel like products of their time. In the original game, the camera view is locked with only the top half of the character visible at the bottom of the screen, and the character's movement direction is completely dependent on the direction that the camera is facing. This is a technique that was used in countless games back then, but third-person games have since moved away from this, offering movement controls that act more independently of the camera direction, allowing you to look one way while running the other. Additionally, the camera view is zoomed out a lot more, giving a better look at the full player model, while also making it much easier to maneuver, especially when doing special actions like climbing or jumping. But it's the combat design that has seen the biggest changes. In the original game, you simply aimed a small crosshair with your mouse and fired away at enemies. There was no cover system, and you could hold several weapons in your inventory at once. But the Definitive Edition reworks this to be more consistent with the more recent Mafia games. Players are now limited to only 2 weapons, a primary and a secondary, and they can pick up extra ammunition automatically by walking over discarded weapons on the ground. Combat is also now focused almost exclusively around a cover system, where you can both blind fire or peek out and line up a more precise shot. Weapon recoil remains difficult to control, so quick bursts from a full Thompson are probably a better choice than just spraying all 50 rounds at once. And the health system remains almost exactly the same, with the only way to replenish your health bar being the occasional first aid boxes mounted on the walls. Though the ability to slide to cover, orbit around objects, and even transition to a better firing angle greatly cleans up the feel of this combat. That being said, the new combat does take a few aspects away, including the ability to roll left or right, and the more precise crosshair, opting for this big, less practical circular crosshair instead. The tweak to the melee combat does make up for this a little bit. The melee system in the original game is just terrible. You can either throw a light, fast punch or press and hold to wind up for a heavy punch, and there doesn't seem to be any way to block, counter, or even target a specific enemy. In the remake, the melee combat is more structured. The game will automatically lock onto enemies as you engage in hand-to-hand combat, and punches will connect more consistently, with the enemy reacting directly to each impact. Instead of heavy punches, a new takedown option will appear once the enemy is weak enough, allowing you to knock them out for good. And there's also a new counter mechanic that allows you to dodge an enemy's attack and strike back. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a really basic melee system, and I frequently found the animations would break for the takedowns, causing Tommy to grapple the air next to an enemy instead. But it's still far more reliable than the silly slap fights used in the original game. Then of course, we have the driving. The driving in the original Mafia is notoriously bad, made infamous by the ridiculously challenging race sequence partway through the campaign. But considering the old-timey vehicles players were stuck driving, it was also something that was easy to accept, and helped add to the game's unique atmosphere. The remake retains a lot of the same driving mechanics that were introduced all those years ago, including the weighty feel and unforgiving cornering offered by each of these Prohibition-era cars. However, they aren't quite as annoying to drive. The vehicles stick to the road better, and spinning out isn't quite as easy. You can even perform a few new maneuvers like a ram, allowing you to bash through police barricades and run enemies off the road. Speaking of which, the vehicular combat has also been reworked, allowing players to simply pull out their handgun and auto-aim at the nearest enemy. This, I think, is a bit of a step backwards in terms of design, as there's no longer a way to target specific things like tires or enemy drivers. Shooting from cars in the original game certainly wasn't perfect, with the crosshair not accurately representing the actual direction that the gun was pointed. but it was at least more immersive and realistic. As I mentioned before, the environment's roads have also been given a huge overhaul, providing wider streets to race through and more alley shortcuts to help avoid confrontation. And there's even additional bridges added to the map, which the original game desperately needed. And for those of you worried about the infamous racetrack mission, it still feels just as challenging as before. You're still going to need some decent driving skills to win first place, and making a single big mistake will definitely require a full race restart. But Hangar 13 did add in a few tweaks to make this more tolerable, including better vehicle handling and new scripted crash moments during each lap that ensure at least 4 racers will always wreck on their own at specific points. It's a little bit easier, and I think die-hard veterans may prefer more legacy options here, but it still feels just as weirdly difficult and out of place as ever. Now, outside of the few tweaks I mentioned previously, the Mafia Remake's gameplay remains pretty loyal to its source material. The missions are all straightforward linear sequences dropped into a semi-open world, and there's nothing to do outside the mission areas, outside of maybe stealing a random car or finding collectibles. Now, usually I don't cover the story in this video series, but I just have to make an exception for this one, as the changes that have been made are pretty fascinating. Every single line of dialogue has been re-recorded for this remake, with a completely brand new cast lending their voices to the characters, along with new motion capture to give each scene a far more polished and cinematic feel. But rather than just re-record the old dry dialogue from before, the writers made some pretty significant tweaks that arguably make for a much more cohesive and convincing performance. Take this opening sequence at the coffee shop, for example. In the original game, Tommy comes into the coffee shop looking for a detective to basically plead for help, setting up this series of flashbacks that make up a bulk of the experience. But in the remake, Tommy is much more confident and seems to have contacted the detective and asked him to meet him at the coffee shop instead. What's more, the actual dialogue exchange is more subtle now, rather than Tommy just loudly explaining his entire criminal past so that everyone can hear. The scene feels more believable than it ever did, and while it's not identical, I think Hangar 13 made the right call. Another big story change worth mentioning is the end of the big race, where Tommy first interacts with Sarah. In the original game, after standing on the podium at the end of the race, the scene transitions to the family celebrating at the bar. Tommy talks a bit to the Don, and then as he's leaving, he has a short exchange with a woman in front of Sarah, where he promptly cuts her off and walks out. You can see Sarah look up for a second, which hints that there's some sort of romantic interest there, but it's hardly noticeable. This has been totally reworked in the remake. Instead of celebrating at the bar, the family instead hangs out in the recreation area around the racetrack. The dialogue is somewhat the same here, but is delivered very differently. As the Don's congratulating Tommy, for example, the camera now shows Sarah in the distance, giving a clear indication of that romantic subplot. And when Tommy approaches her afterwards, it's Sarah that delivers the line that the other woman spoke before, only with a bit of a sarcastic edge to it. She then explains that Paulie's been getting drunk and you then need to find him and drive him back home, adding a new objective that was never in the game before. There's just so much more personality packed into the story now, and when combined with the already solid foundation of the original plot, the end result is a fantastic narrative that feels like it could easily be its own major motion picture. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you think has the better overall sound quality?
Officers report suspect found. Get on it, please.
Lichtenberg's in trouble. There's something up with his car.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Mafia Definitive Edition is an absolutely fantastic remake of the original 2002 fan favorite. The visuals look incredible, the gameplay has been modernized without stripping away the original's charm, and the story has been significantly expanded upon, fleshing out all the major characters and providing players with a more memorable experience as a result. And I'd love to see Hangar 13 put as much love and detail into a completely brand new Mafia experience moving forward. But what do you guys think? Are you impressed with Mafia Definitive Edition, or do you still prefer the original classic? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.